The Alchemy of Tyranny. And I want to start with a quote from Jung. This is responding to an interview in 1952 with Mircea Eliade. The work is difficult and strewn with obstacles. The alchemical opus is dangerous. Right at the beginning, you meet the dragon, the chthonic spirit, the devil, or as the alchemists called it, the blackness of Negredo. And this encounter produces suffering. Matter suffers right up to the final disappearance of the blackness. In psychological terms, the soul finds itself in the throes of melancholy, locked up in a struggle with the shadow. The mystery of the Coniunctio, the central mystery of alchemy, aims precisely at the synthesis of opposites, the assimilation of the blackness, the integration of the devil. So part one, from Prague to Budapest, a journey through Central Europe. We expected to enjoy a leisurely 12 days in Central Europe, cruising down the Danube and stepping off the boat to explore medieval towns and villages, going on hikes and bike rides through the gorgeous countryside. A respite from the analytic practice, teaching, and administrative duties. What transpired revealed itself to be quite another journey altogether, something that would leave indelible marks upon us. We began our sojourn in Prague with a visit to the Speculum Alchemy, a jewel of the medieval alchemical world that was only rediscovered in 2002, when massive flooding on the Vltava River created a huge sinkhole in the street in front of the house at number 1 Hestalska. This revealed a series of underground alchemical laboratories dating back to the 16th century, attributed to the Habsburg ruler of that period, Emperor Rudolf II. Astrology and alchemy were regarded as mainstream scientific fields in Renaissance Prague, though not approved by the Catholic Church. Rudolf was apparently deeply interested in both these new sciences, and his lifelong quest was to find the philosopher's stone. This was his own private and secret alchemical laboratory that was hidden underground in the Jewish quarter of the city, away from prying canonical eyes. The house itself, at the current location of the museum, dates back to 900 CE, which means that the house is probably the second oldest house in Prague. The house is located on what was then the most important medieval European trade route, the Gran Via, which was thousands of miles long and ran from the north of Spain across the whole of Europe to the Far East. The central location of Prague, between east and west, made for a natural trading point. From the back of the main floor, we locate an ancient hidden stairwell and begin descending down uneven stone steps in a circular formation until we reach the first of 4 underground caverns, seemingly carved out of the natural rock. As you turn right at the bottom of the stairwell, you are seized by the sight of the first chamber, about 20 feet square, filled with large spiral-shaped stone, with a large spiral-shaped stone fireplace, and upon it, fantastical-looking glass containers with long, sloping mouths of every size and shape. You cannot escape the feeling of being transported back in time, 500 years, to this authentic medieval alchemical laboratory. This room served the distillation process. A second chamber served as the storage space for the various herbs used for the process. A third chamber was devoted to the manufacture of the glass vials and large containers. Underground tunnels were discovered that connected to the 3 most important places in the city: Prague Castle, the Old Town Hall, and the military barracks. Rumor has it that the Pope, discovering word of Rudolf's alchemical interest, sent a Vatican emissary to confront Rudolf with his illegal activities. But Rudolf needed not have worried, for the emissary himself, it turns out, was a practicing alchemist. Jung felt that when he discovered alchemy, he had stumbled upon a historical counterpart of his psychology of the unconscious. The principal similarity was that of projection. The alchemist, while attempting to create gold from the four basic elements of mercury, lead, sulfur, and salt, was seeing certain properties in that matter. But in fact, what the alchemist was seeing and experiencing were projections from his own unconscious. What he was experiencing had nothing to do with the matter itself. Jung also stated, the alchemical operations are real, only this reality was not physical, but psychological. Alchemy represents the projection of a drama, both cosmic and spiritual, in laboratory terms. The opus magnum had two aims: the rescue of the human soul and the salvation of the cosmos. What the alchemist called matter was in reality the unconscious self, the soul of the world, the anima mundi, which was identified with the spiritus mercurius, which was imprisoned in the matter. It is for this reason that the alchemist believed in the quote-unquote truth of the matter. Fast forward to 2018, when we were about to discover just what was currently brewing in the alchemical cauldron of Central Europe, beginning in the Czech Republic, followed by stops in Austria and then Hungary. Leaving Prague and its rich alchemical history, we traveled 50 miles south to another medieval city, Český Krumlov, where time again seems to have stood still. Krumlov literally means twisted, which the Vltava River here does numerous times, creating a natural moat around a small isthmus that contains an entire medieval village crowned by a 13th century castle. Within this somewhat spectacular setting, we were shocked to hear our guide inform us that 55% of the current Czech population would rather live under a communistic system, despite almost 3 decades now living under a democracy. Democracy took hold after the Velvet Revolution in 1989, which allowed the countries to peacefully break away from the yoke of Soviet communist rule. Our guide further explained that under the communist Soviet system, which ruled from 1948 to 1989, every adult was assigned both a job and an apartment. This may not seem much to those of us coming from an affluent North American lifestyle, but for people who've had difficulty adjusting to a free market system over the last 30 years, it is significant. To understand the present situation in the Czech Republic, one has to explore its complicated history, at least back to World War II. It was in 1938 when the Czechs were sold out by the West to appease Hitler under the Munich Agreement. With that agreement, half of all their land was ceded to the Nazis without their consent. An act of appeasement that not only famously failed, but emboldened Hitler to go to war. After the war, Czech nationalists returned from both London and Moscow in large numbers. But democracy gave way to communism and a more open attitude towards the Soviet Union, which had liberated the country from the Germans. At first elected democratically in 1946, the communists took power in a coup in 1948, establishing a single-party state. It took until 1989 and the Velvet Revolution, led by the playwright Václav Havel, for democracy to be restored under a multi-party system that remains today. Havel brought the nation into both NATO and the European Union and the liberal values of the West. But today those values are under fire. James Kirchik, in his 2017 book entitled The End of Europe, writes, Havel's death seemingly marked the passing not only of a great man, but also a legacy. His vision of an open, pluralistic, and confident Europe has been neglected, if not outright repudiated. In his own country and elsewhere across the continent, Havel's immediate successor, Václav Klaus, a friend and ally of Vladimir Putin, forsook his own nation's history as a target of Warsaw Pact invasion and supported Russia unequivocally when it invaded and annexed Ukrainian territory. From a depth psychological perspective, one might ask, what is happening in the unconscious of both the leaders and the electorate of the Czech Republic? Why is it that a majority of people would still rather live under a totalitarian regime than a free democracy? Consciously, at least to us in the West, who have grown up with liberal democratic values, this seems obscene. But the conscious collective attitude of many in the Czech Republic, most notably those outside of liberal Prague, is that they do not trust the liberal democratic values of the West and would prefer the seeming security of living in a totalitarian state run by a strongman. Given Europe's violent past in the last century, with its two horrific world wars, this seems a very chilling and puzzling conclusion. What are they seeing into the matter that we do not see? Evidence of this violent past is palpable at our next stop at the Mauthausen concentration camp, just over the border in Austria. From 1938 to 1945, Mauthausen, along with its satellite camps, housed over 350,000 Jewish and political prisoners from many different European countries. Of these, only about 90,000 survived. The stated goal of the camp was, quote unquote, to work you to death. This working of prisoners to death was accomplished through the dangerous operation of a large granite quarry without any safety standards or proper equipment. Here, hundreds of SS guards cruelly tortured their prisoners at every opportunity. Each evening, at the end of the workday, each prisoner was forced to carry a granite stone weighing over 100 pounds up 186 steps, named the Stairs of Death, to the top of the camp. Not because this was efficient, but only because the guards wanted to make them suffer. The prisoners were made to construct the entire camp while being half starved to death. The 30-foot-high granite walls extend for about a mile in circumference, encircling many acres of land and buildings that included the barracks, offices, hospital, gas chambers, and crematorium. On these grounds, the sense of horror is overwhelming and remains with me now. What were the Nazis projecting onto the Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, the disabled, and intelligentsia that they brutally and systematically killed them by the tens of thousands? Our Austrian guide Therese carefully explained to us that every inhabitant of the town of Mauthausen, largely Austrian Catholics, was complicit with what went on at the camp, as the thousands of SS officers who worked at the camp were housed with the town's families. Throughout the war, boxcars unloaded thousands of new prisoners at the train depot in the town, where they disembarked and were forced to march 3 miles through the town and uphill to the camp. Mauthausen was the last concentration camp liberated at the end of World War II in May 1945 by American troops. Outside the main entrance to the camp, several monuments from various countries commemorate the death and torture of its citizens who were imprisoned there. One stood out to us, which had the simple words carved into it, "Be alert." Be alert. I had the feeling talking with Austrians that the fascist past is never too far from the surface. Evidence of this is that a right-wing and anti-immigration party, the Freedom Party, has recently come to power in a coalition with the Austrian People's Party, which is another right-wing party. Many of their members are now assigned to important cabinet posts, including immigration. The Freedom Party was founded in 1956 by former SS officers. Now, author James Kirchick, again in his 2017 book, The End of Europe, articulates a valid point. Rising support across Europe for xenophobic populist parties is partly the result of a constricted political discourse in which decent, ordinary people are told that not only plainly visible social phenomena don't exist, for example, a genuine terrorist threat is created when you admit tens of thousands of people into your country from the Middle East, but also that voicing concerns about these allegedly non-existent phenomena is racist. By not allowing these debates in liberal democracies such as Sweden and Germany, European elites have only fed the monster they hope to destroy. The last stop on our journey was Budapest. It is spectacularly framed by the hills of Buda on the west, the bustling metropolis of Pest to the east, and the wide, fast-flowing Danube in between. The physical beauty of Budapest is stunning. The politics, unfortunately, are rather ugly. The Viktor Orban-led Fidesz party government, since winning a landslide election in 2010, which it further solidified in 2014 and 2018, after gerrymandering the electoral districts, has, according to Krichik, rewritten the Constitution, centralized power in the executive, weakened checks and balances, empowered an oligarchic class, dispensed state awards, and ceded cultural policy to extreme right-wing figures. They've also rendered Parliament a rubber stamp, overhauled public media institutions into partisan outlets, harassed civil society, and reorientated Hungary's traditional Western and pro-European foreign policy towards Russia and other authoritarian regimes like China. Already enforcing the strictest closed-door policy across the European Union for immigrants at its borders, the Fidesz government, while we were in Budapest, issued new legal measures allowing for the prosecution and jailing of human rights workers and volunteers for providing services, advice, or support to migrants and asylum seekers. The new Hungarian system of government is being called a liberal democracy, but it more closely resembles a totalitarian state. Orban is consciously dismantling the democracy in a steady, systematic fashion, replacing it with tyranny and telling its people that the change will be good for them. Taking a step back to see beyond Hungary, Austria, and the Czech Republic in Central Europe, one is further struck by how these nationalist populist parties are gaining ground all across Europe. In the West, this includes England, with Boris Johnson now as the conservative leader and prime minister, dealing with a messy Brexit. France with Marine Le Pen and her National Front Party, financially supported by Russia and Putin. The Sweden Democrats and the True Finns in the north, and in the south, Greece's Golden Dawn Party. In the programs and statements of these parties, observes Columbia University's Robert Paxton, one hears echoes of classical fascist themes. Fears of decadence and decline, assertion of national and cultural identity, a threat by foreigners who cannot be assimilated into the national identity, and the need for greater authority to deal with these problems. There is no doubt that liberal democratic governments in both the United States and Europe have not always dealt honestly with the real problems of immigration and those left behind within the modern global economy over at least the last 30 years. This failure has created an opportunity for ultra-right-wing nationalist parties to gain an increasing foothold among their frustrated electorates. Many view their leaders as being tone-deaf and self-serving, taking turns at the helm of the national government, not seeming to care about the voters, but rather catering to elite special interests. In the 2016 U.S. election, Donald Trump changed all of that. A vote for Trump was a vote against the party establishments, who many believe were not listening anymore. We are still in shock 3 years later, and with good reason. Psychologically speaking, Trump emerged through the dark shadow of this country's history from the very bowels of the earth, like a trickster archetype manifesting itself from the depths to warn humankind and its governments that we all are now in peril if we cannot find a new ruling principle. Uncaring establishment parties, along with an extreme, politically correct left liberalism, have constellated an equal and opposite force of extreme right-wing values, with each side demonizing the other while they lose their ability to think clearly from a balanced and objective position. When you distill tyranny down to its base elements, you always find the same rancid ingredients: hate, fear, anger, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration, and a demonization of anything other. A pure and utterly unconscious projection of the shadow onto that other. And when this projection is being consciously promoted by authoritarian rulers around the world, including the likes of Putin, Trump, and Orban, it is nothing less than incarnated evil. Our problem at its root is not political, but moral and spiritual in nature, where the concepts of the greater good and we the people have all but disappeared. 75 years after World War II and the forward movement of democratic liberalism throughout the world, the ground is shifting again. And those hard-fought-for values are under increasing duress. Consistent with Jung's concept of psychological enantiodromia, the pendulum is swinging back now in the opposite direction, and we find ourselves in a collective global regression of these liberal democratic values. In 1994, Václav Havel told the European Parliament, "If the future European order does not emerge from a broadening European Union, based upon the best European values and willing to transmit and defend them, the organization of the future could well fall into the hands of a caste of fools, fanatics, populists, and demagogues, waiting for their chance and determined to promote the worst in Europe." And I think we see that that's coming to fruition now in Europe and beyond. So I'd like to pause here for a moment and go down another path, which is to look at the psychology of tyrants. And then I'll come back in the last part and summarize the main theme. I've entitled this section, Strange Magic, Understanding the Psychology of Tyrants. The psychology of tyrants follows a very specific path that, although not surprising perhaps, demands elucidation. The one common thread of all tyrants is their narcissism. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, the essential feature of narcissistic personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy that begins in early adulthood and is present in a variety of contexts. Narcissists typically exaggerate their achievements and are often surprised when others don't share in their view of themselves. They tend to be obsessed with fantasies about their outstanding success, intellectual ability, power, and beauty. Narcissists typically exaggerate their achievements and are often surprised when others don't share in their view of themselves. They tend to be obsessed with fantasies. They have a tendency to believe that they are quite special and unique, and therefore can only be understood by others who are also special and unique. They expect excessive admiration from others and are often puzzled when they don't receive it. They have a very keen sense of entitlement, that is, they expect to be treated differently because they are, in their eyes, special and unique. And if these expectations are not met, they can become extremely angry and volatile, lashing out at others around them. Narcissists have a tendency to manipulate those around them to support them in their fantasy of how special and unique they are, and they cultivate these relationships. They have a distinct lack of empathy for others. That is, they do not have the reflective ability to understand how they may be emotionally affecting others around them by their behavior. And if brought to their attention, they most often deny and/or repress any awareness. Narcissists are usually envious of others and typically believe that others are also envious of them. Lastly, it's not uncommon for narcissists to demonstrate arrogant attitudes towards others. Malignant narcissism. You will not find the concept of malignant narcissism in the DSM-5. It is, however, a very practical and effective interpretation by which to grasp a fuller picture of the personality of tyrants. It was a term first coined by Erich Fromm, a well-known social psychologist of his generation, in 1964. Fromm defined malignant narcissism as a severe mental sickness representing the quintessence of evil. He characterized the condition as the most severe pathology and the root of the most vicious destructiveness and inhumanity. A common feature of narcissism is the recurring need to always be the center of attention. Their low self-esteem demands reinforcement, validation, and admiration at all times. However, this isn't the case with malignant narcissism. Those with this personality type have completely assumed their role of superiority and magnificence, and they don't doubt it for a second. The only thing they look for is to position themselves in a high rank wherever they go. Fromm described them as follows. They feel powerful due to those qualities that they believe were given to them at birth. I'm better than you. Therefore, I don't need to prove anything. I don't need to interact with anyone or make any effort either. I move further and further away from reality the more I maintain this image of greatness. The primary difference between narcissism and malignant narcissism is that malignant narcissism includes comorbid features of other personality disorders, and thus consists of a broader range of symptoms than narcissistic personality disorder alone. In malignant narcissism, NPD is accompanied by additional symptoms of antisocial, paranoid, and sadistic personality disorder. Whereas individuals with NPD will deliberately damage other people in pursuit of their own selfish desires, they may regret doing so and, in some circumstances, show remorse for doing so. Because the traits of antisocial personality disorder are present in malignant narcissism, the malignant narcissist suffers from a more pervasive lack of empathy than someone with NPD alone, and will lack feelings of guilt or remorse for the damage he or she causes. Since sadism is often considered a feature of malignant narcissism, an individual with the syndrome may not only lack feelings of guilt or remorse for hurting others, but may even derive pleasure from the gratuitous infliction of mental or physical pain on others. The American psychologist Theodore Millon claimed that there were 4 subtypes of sadism, which he termed enforcing sadism, explosive sadism, spineless sadism, and tyrannical sadism. Millon described a tyrannical sadist as one who relishes menacing and brutalizing others, forcing them to cower and submit, verbally cutting and scathing, accusatory and destructive, intentionally surly, abusive, inhumane, unmerciful. It is not difficult to see how these descriptors fit the likes of Putin, Orban, and Trump like a well-fitted glove to a hand. Summary: tyranny versus freedom. We stand now at a stunningly distinct crossroads in American and global history. The encroachment of tyranny and tyrannical rule in Europe, Asia, and America is becoming a smothering daily reality. Democracy and democratic rights for all citizens are slipping away day after day. And for the moment at least, the tyrannical Trump, a pathological liar and malignant narcissist, is triumphing over the democratic beliefs of a majority of American citizens. Attacks on the free press, voting rights, the courts, intelligence agencies, and immigrants in general continues unabated. For those of us of a certain age, it seems quite surreal that we would be, in the year 2020, at the threshold of another fascist crisis, a mere 75 years after World War II and the defeat of Hitler and the Nazis. And yet, here we are. It reminds one of the quote attributed to Thomas Charlton in 1909 of the necessity of, and I quote, fastening upon the minds of the American people the belief that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. The alchemy of freedom. The only antidote for the alchemy of tyranny is something stronger that can stand up to it, what I call the alchemy of freedom. Tyranny is made up of the toxic elements of inequality, divisiveness, repetitive lies and conspiracy theories, fear, hate, and anger. These are all unconscious shadow properties of the mob that have been infected with a lethal psychosis by malignant narcissistic leaders in their populations. These are largely people who believe that their leaders have their best interests at heart and will protect them, when in reality they are being exploited by those leaders as mere objects. All of these unconscious shadow properties are then projected onto the other. The alchemy of freedom consists of the elements of equality, individuality, government succession in a true democracy, integration, and the truth. Specifically, freedom is based upon the ability to differentiate truth from fiction, and to be able to do this, one must be able to reflect and think things through. One must not just accept anything one reads or sees on Facebook or YouTube. One must think as an individual, not as part of a mob infected with a psychosis. This requires discipline and effort of will. This demands paying attention. This demands an eternal vigilance. This is the price of freedom. The psychological reality of the present time is that we are woefully unconscious, individually and collectively. And as Jung pointed out, it is only each individual, one person at a time, who can become more conscious. And the question he raised then is the very same as it is today. Will there be enough conscious individuals in the world to prevent us from destroying ourselves? In 1957, just 12 years after World War II had been fought and won against fascism, Jung stated, happiness and contentment, equability of soul, and meaningfulness of life, these can be experienced only by the individual and not by the state, which, on the one hand, is nothing but a convention of independent individuals, and at the other, continually threatens to paralyze and threaten the individual. In this respect, our social goals commit the error of overlooking the psychology of the person for whom they are intended, and very often of promoting only his illusions. I am neither spurred on by excessive optimism nor in love with high ideals, but am merely concerned with the fate of the individual human being, that infinitesimal unit on whom a world depends, and in whom, if we are to read the Christian message aright, even God seeks his goal. Thank you.